The American Dream, A History of the Nation's Ideals, written by Harry Montgomery, narrated by Ceda Reyes. Chapter 1, Origins of the Dream. The roots of the American Dream reach back to the earliest colonial settlements, when European settlers arrived with hopes of building a better life far from the constraints of their homelands. For many, the New World offered something previously unimaginable: land ownership, religious freedom, and the possibility of rising above the station into which they were born. These opportunities, though limited to a select group at the time, laid the foundation for the evolving idea that anyone could succeed through hard work and determination. In this fertile but dangerous land, ambition was a necessity, and the early colonists began to shape a cultural identity around individualism and perseverance. As the colonies grew and developed, tensions with Britain intensified, giving rise to revolutionary ideas that would further fuel the American dream. The rejection of monarchy and the assertion of natural rights became central to the vision of a new nation. The revolution itself was not just a fight for independence, but also a declaration that ordinary people had the right to govern themselves. The rhetoric of the time emphasized liberty, equality, and the pursuit of happiness, concepts that would become permanently embedded in the national consciousness. The struggle to gain freedom was brutal and uneven, but the ideals expressed during this time continued to inspire generations to believe in the possibility of social mobility and personal fulfillment. One of the most significant documents in American history, the Declaration of Independence, formalized the promise of the American dream. Its bold claim that all men are created equal introduced a national aspiration that transcended the immediate political conflict. Although in practice this equality was far from realized, the statement set a powerful ideal against which future Americans would measure their progress. It transformed a political rebellion into a moral mission, giving the young nation an identity rooted in hope, promise, and self-determination. The years following independence saw the slow formation of institutions that would attempt to embody these ideals. The Constitution, with its checks and balances, and the Bill of Rights, with its guarantees of individual freedom, aimed to build a society where opportunity was protected and individual potential could flourish. Yet even in this formative period, glaring contradictions persisted. Slavery, disenfranchisement, and inequality were deeply entrenched, highlighting the gap between the dream and reality. Still, the idea of America as a land of possibility persisted, often more as myth than reality, but powerful nonetheless. By the end of the 18th century, the American dream had emerged as more than just a set of political principles. It became a cultural narrative. The belief that one could rise through merit and effort began to take hold in the national imagination. Though access to this dream was uneven, its symbolic power grew stronger with each generation. It would take centuries of struggle to expand its promises to all Americans, but the foundational ideals laid during this early period created a framework that would shape the nation's future and its sense of identity. Colonial aspirations and the promise of land. When the first European settlers crossed the Atlantic and arrived in North America, they were driven by a mix of desperation, ambition, and hope. Many fled religious persecution, political unrest, or economic hardship, seeking a fresh start in a land they believed to be full of opportunity. For them, America represented a place where the rigid hierarchies of European society could be left behind, where land could be claimed, and a new life could be carved out from the wilderness. The promise of land ownership, in particular, held powerful meaning. In Europe, land was the foundation of wealth and status, typically reserved for the nobility. In the colonies, however, land was more plentiful, and with it came the possibility of independence and self-sufficiency. This dream was not equally accessible to all, but for many settlers, it was the first real chance to own property and build something for future generations. The lure of land was a key motivator for expansion and colonization as settlers pushed further into indigenous territories. As towns grew and plantations spread, land ownership became central to the idea of success. It was not only an economic asset, but also a symbol of one's place in society. Colonists believed that by working hard and cultivating their property, they could create wealth, secure their family's future, and gain a voice in the community. This belief helped foster the early seeds of the American dream, a vision of prosperity through personal effort. English colonial policy often encouraged this mindset. Headright systems, for example, awarded land to settlers willing to populate new territories, reinforcing the notion that opportunity was tied to initiative. Land was also used as a reward for service or loyalty, tying it to both economic and political aspirations. For many poor Europeans, these arrangements were a golden opportunity to escape the cycle of poverty. The idea that social advancement was possible through land ownership set the colonies apart from the Old World, where birth often dictated destiny. However, the promise of land was not without its darker consequences. Indigenous peoples who had long lived on and cared for these lands were displaced, often violently. Treaties were broken, and native communities were driven out or destroyed in the name of settlement. While colonists dreamed of freedom and prosperity, that dream was frequently built on the backs of others who were denied both. Additionally, the rise of plantation agriculture in the southern colonies tied land ownership to the institution of slavery, introducing a contradiction that would haunt the American ideal for centuries to come. Despite these contradictions, the promise of land remained a powerful motivator for generations of Americans. It helped shape the national identity as a land of opportunity, where one could gain not only material success, but also independence and dignity. Even today, the legacy of this belief continues to influence American culture and values. In the colonial period, land was more than soil. It was the foundation of hope, the measure of ambition, and the first true symbol of what would come to be known as the American dream. Revolutionary ideals and the pursuit of liberty. The American Revolution was not only a military struggle for independence, but a profound ideological movement that reshaped how people thought about power, rights, and the individual. At its heart was a radical assertion that all people possessed certain inalienable rights and that government existed not to rule over the people, but to serve them. These ideas were heavily influenced by Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke, who argued that life, liberty, and property were natural rights that no king or parliament could take away. The colonists embraced these beliefs as they challenged British authority, giving rise to a new political philosophy rooted in liberty and self-governance. Tensions with Britain had grown over time, particularly as the Crown imposed taxes and trade restrictions without granting the colonies direct representation. The rallying cry of "no taxation without representation" was not just a complaint about taxes. It was a demand for autonomy and a rejection of tyranny. Many colonists came to see British rule as incompatible with their vision of freedom. The revolutionary movement began to frame their struggle as a moral cause, asserting that liberty was not a privilege granted by monarchs, but a birthright. This sense of righteousness fueled the commitment of ordinary farmers, artisans, and merchants who risked everything for a future shaped by their own hands. The Declaration of Independence, adopted in 1776, became the defining document of this ideological shift. Penned primarily by Thomas Jefferson, it boldly stated that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. Though clearly not all individuals in colonial society were treated equally, the Declaration set a powerful ideal that would reverberate through American history. It marked a turning point in how a nation could define itself, not by royal lineage or inherited status, but by shared beliefs in freedom, equality, and human dignity. This vision was revolutionary not just politically, but philosophically. inspiring other nations and movements around the world. As the war for independence unfolded, the ideals of liberty and justice were tested on the battlefield and in the halls of early American government. The revolution was not a single moment, but a long, painful process of becoming. Some Americans questioned whether the rhetoric of freedom could coexist with slavery, prompting early abolitionist voices to emerge. Women, too, began to advocate for greater recognition, even as they were largely excluded from the rights being championed. These contradictions did not destroy the power of revolutionary ideals, but highlighted the work still to be done in fulfilling them. The struggle for liberty had opened a door, but the path beyond it was uneven and fraught with challenges. In the aftermath of independence, the ideals forged during the Revolution became the foundation of the American identity. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights codified many of these principles, embedding protections for speech, religion, and due process into the law. Although the young nation would continue to grapple with the gap between its ideals and its realities, the pursuit of liberty remained at its core. Revolutionary thought had given Americans a new way to see themselves, not as subjects of an empire, but as citizens of a republic, capable of shaping their own destiny. The dream of liberty was now inseparable from the American story. The Declaration and the birth of a national vision. The signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776 marked more than a political separation from Britain. It signified the creation of a new identity, a bold reimagining of what a nation could be. For the first time, a collective of colonies proclaimed that government derived its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, not divine right or inherited power. This document laid out a vision of a society built on individual rights, equality, and the pursuit of happiness. Though the immediate goal was to justify rebellion, the Declaration also gave birth to a lasting national ideal that would guide the United States through its most trying times and inspire movements for justice for generations to come. The language of the Declaration was both aspirational and transformative. Thomas Jefferson, drawing on Enlightenment philosophy, distilled complex ideas into accessible, resonant words. The assertion that all men are created equal was a revolutionary claim in an age of monarchies and rigid social classes. By declaring that people had unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the document proposed a radical departure from the traditional power structures of the time. These principles were not merely stated as goals, but as inherent truths, providing a moral foundation for the new nation. What made the Declaration powerful was not only its message, but also its timing. As war raged and uncertainty clouded the future, it gave the colonies a unifying purpose. It elevated the struggle from a mere colonial dispute to a global assertion of human rights and dignity. The document was printed and spread widely, stirring passions and solidifying a shared sense of destiny among a diverse and fractured population. It helped people see themselves not just as Virginians or Pennsylvanians, but as Americans united by a common vision. That vision, however imperfectly realized at first, became the touchstone for American identity. Despite its lofty ideals, the Declaration existed within a society that still practiced slavery, excluded women from political life, and denied basic rights to indigenous peoples. These contradictions were apparent even at the time, and some voices, including those of Black Americans and early reformers, called attention to the gap between the nation's promises and its practices. Still, the principles embedded in the document proved resilient and influential. Over the years, the words of the Declaration would be invoked by abolitionists, suffragists, civil rights leaders, and countless others seeking to make the nation live up to its stated values. The Declaration of Independence was more than a formal announcement. It was the first articulation of what the United States hoped to become. It offered a philosophical blueprint for a society built on freedom and opportunity. Although the path toward that vision has been long and often painful, the ideas set forth in 1776 established the foundation for a national dream that continues to evolve. The birth of that vision began with a single document, but its influence would grow far beyond the immediate moment, becoming the beating heart of the American experiment. Chapter 2: Expansion and Opportunity. As the United States emerged from its revolutionary beginnings, a new era of ambition and restlessness began to take hold. The vast, untamed lands stretching westward promised endless possibility, drawing settlers, entrepreneurs, and dreamers eager to claim a piece of the American frontier. Expansion became both a physical and ideological project, tied closely to the belief that the American dream could be realized through courage, labor, and movement. The wilderness was not merely terrain. It represented a blank slate on which Americans could construct their lives anew, free from the constraints of the past. In this growing republic, land and opportunity were linked in the minds of many, fueling migration, development, and conflict. Manifest destiny soon emerged as the defining principle behind this aggressive expansion. The idea that the United States was destined to spread from coast to coast gained traction in the early 19th century, influencing public policy and popular imagination alike. It was seen not only as a right, but as a moral obligation to extend American institutions, values, and civilization across the continent. This belief justified the acquisition of new territories through treaties, purchases, and wars. From the Louisiana Purchase to the annexation of Texas and the conquest of lands held by Mexico, expansion was pursued with fervor, supported by both government policy and public sentiment. Immigrants from around the world added to the momentum, viewing the United States as a land of promise. Fleeing famine, political unrest, and poverty, millions arrived with the hope of forging a better future. The image of America as a place where one could rise through determination and effort took deeper root with every arrival. For many, simply owning a small farm, opening a business, or finding steady employment represented a fulfillment of dreams unimaginable in their homelands. Cities expanded, railroads crisscrossed the land, and economic growth surged as the country pushed outward. The dream of opportunity became not only personal, but national, an engine of growth and innovation. But this period of opportunity was also marked by exclusion and displacement. Indigenous peoples faced violent removal and confinement to reservations as settlers encroached on their lands. The Indian Removal Act, for example, enabled the forced migration of Native communities, often at great human cost. Additionally, the expansion of slavery into new territories deepened national divisions, bringing into question whether the American dream truly applied to all. While many profited and prospered, others suffered or were left behind, revealing the limitations and hypocrisies embedded within the ideal of equal opportunity. Despite its complexities, the narrative of expansion became deeply woven into the American identity. It reinforced the idea that prosperity was available to those willing to work and take risks. The frontier became symbolic of freedom, individualism, and self-reliance. It created a cultural mythology that celebrated the pioneer spirit while obscuring the costs paid by others. As the nation spread across the continent, it carried with it the powerful belief that growth equaled progress, and that with each mile conquered, the American dream became more attainable. Expansion was more than a movement of people. It was a defining chapter in the country's evolving sense of purpose and possibility. Westward movement and manifest destiny. In the decades following independence, Americans increasingly turned their eyes westward, drawn by the lure of open land, natural resources, and the promise of a better life. This period of territorial expansion was not random or purely economic. It was underpinned by a powerful belief system known as manifest destiny. This widely held conviction asserted that the United States was divinely ordained to expand across the North American continent, spreading its values, institutions, and civilization. Westward movement was seen as not only inevitable, but righteous, a fulfillment of the nation's destiny. The spirit of this belief shaped government policy, popular culture, and the dreams of countless settlers eager to begin anew. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 nearly doubled the size of the United States and signaled the beginning of a new era. With each territorial gain, from Florida and Oregon to Texas and California, momentum grew. Wagon trains, homesteaders, and prospectors moved steadily west, often facing grueling journeys and great uncertainty. For many Americans, particularly small farmers, the West symbolized freedom from debt, landlords, and class hierarchies. It promised self-sufficiency and control over one's own fate, reinforcing the ideal that success could be achieved through hard work and determination. The government supported this belief by offering land through measures like the Homestead Act, which granted plots to citizens willing to settle and cultivate them. At the same time, manifest destiny was used to justify military action and political decisions that dramatically reshaped the continent. The annexation of Texas led to the Mexican-American War, resulting in the U.S. gaining large portions of the Southwest. The Oregon Trail and the California Gold Rush brought hundreds of thousands into these new territories, accelerating the transformation of landscapes and local economies. While the West provided immense opportunity for some, it also introduced major challenges to national unity, especially regarding the expansion of slavery into new territories, a controversy that would later fuel the Civil War. The ideology of manifest destiny was often couched in moral language, portraying expansion as a mission to bring democracy, Christianity, and modernity to less developed regions. But in practice, it led to the displacement and suffering of Native American tribes whose lands were seized or invaded. Treaties were broken and forced removals became common, as indigenous communities were pushed aside to make way for American settlers. The belief in the nation's exceptionalism often ignored the human cost of expansion and contributed to a mythologized version of the West that concealed its violence and inequality. Despite its contradictions, westward movement became central to the national narrative. It reinforced a belief in progress, innovation, and the limitless potential of the American people. The rugged individualism of the pioneers, the triumph over nature, and the dream of land ownership all contributed to a powerful cultural identity. Manifest destiny shaped not only maps but minds, encouraging Americans to view expansion as both their right and their duty. The legacy of this movement is still visible today, not just in the physical geography of the United States, but in its enduring belief in reinvention, mobility, and the boundless pursuit of a better tomorrow. Immigration and the land of opportunity. Throughout the 19th century, the United States became a magnet for immigrants from around the world, drawn by the powerful image of America as a land where anyone could succeed through hard work and determination. This vision of the United States as a place of endless opportunity was more than myth. It was a lived experience for many who left behind poverty, oppression, or limited prospects in their homelands. Waves of immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Italy, China, and Eastern Europe arrived with the hope of claiming a piece of the American dream. Their arrival reshaped the cultural, economic, and social fabric of the growing nation. For many, the promise of land and employment was enough to risk the long and often perilous journey. The expansion of railroads, factories, and urban centers created an enormous demand for labor. Immigrants filled these roles, contributing to the rapid growth of American industry and infrastructure. At the same time, the West offered agricultural opportunity, and many immigrant families settled on farms, working the land and establishing new communities. The possibility of owning property and securing a better future for one's children stood in stark contrast to the rigid class structures many had escaped. Even in harsh conditions, the sense of possibility was real and motivating. Ellis Island became the iconic gateway for millions arriving on the East Coast, a symbol of both hope and hardship. The process of arrival could be daunting, but for those who passed through, stepping onto American soil represented a new beginning. Cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco swelled with diverse populations, becoming centers of culture, commerce, and ambition. While language barriers, discrimination, and economic exploitation were common, many immigrants still managed to build lives of stability and pride. They opened small businesses, formed tight-knit neighborhoods, and participated in the growing labor movements that sought better conditions for all workers. However, the influx of newcomers also sparked fear and resistance. Nativist sentiments emerged among segments of the American population who viewed immigrants as threats to their jobs, culture, and security. This led to exclusionary laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act and immigration quotas aimed at limiting the arrival of certain nationalities. Despite these obstacles, the ideal of the United States as a land of opportunity persisted, often upheld most strongly by the very people who had to fight hardest to find their place in it. Immigration during this period was not just a demographic shift. It was a reaffirmation of the American dream. The determination of immigrants to work, sacrifice, and succeed breathed life into the ideals of equality and mobility that defined the nation's vision of itself. Their stories were woven into the broader narrative of American progress, reinforcing the belief that anyone, regardless of origin, could rise through perseverance. Though the path was uneven and often marked by struggle, the millions who came chasing opportunity helped build the United States into a dynamic and diverse nation. Their pursuit of a better life became one of the most enduring symbols of what America promised and what it continually aspired to become. The Gold Rush and Economic Hope. In 1848, the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill in California triggered a wave of excitement that quickly spread across the United States and the world. The California Gold Rush was one of the most dramatic and influential moments in American history, drawing hundreds of thousands of people with the promise of sudden wealth and a fresh start. For many, it was the ultimate expression of the American dream, an opportunity to transform one's life overnight through luck, determination, and effort. The notion that fortune lay just beneath the surface of the earth captured imaginations and spurred one of the largest mass migrations in U.S. history. People came from all walks of life and from every corner of the globe. Prospectors, laborers, merchants, and adventurers poured into California by ship and wagon, driven by hope more than certainty. These fortune seekers, later called 49ers, endured treacherous journeys and harsh living conditions in the mining camps. They worked long hours, often with little success, yet the dream of striking it rich kept their spirits high. The gold rush offered a rare moment when class, background, and status seemed secondary to the raw possibility of discovery. It briefly upended traditional hierarchies and reinforced the idea that anyone could succeed if given the chance. The economic effects of the gold rush were immediate and far-reaching. California's population exploded, and towns like San Francisco transformed from sleepy outposts to bustling cities almost overnight. Infrastructure rapidly developed as businesses emerged to supply miners with tools, clothing, food, and services. The surge of activity helped integrate California into the national economy and accelerated its path to statehood in 1850. Beyond the mining camps, industries such as transportation, banking, and construction flourished, laying the groundwork for long-term economic growth in the region. While the dream of instant wealth drove the gold rush, the reality was far more complex. A few did find great fortunes, but most miners ended up with modest earnings or none at all. Still, many remained in California, transitioning into other trades and contributing to the growing economy. For them, even if gold did not deliver riches, the move itself opened up new possibilities. The gold rush thus shifted from a narrow pursuit of treasure to a broader pursuit of opportunity, reshaping the American West into a land of ambition and reinvention. However, the boom also had darker consequences. Indigenous populations were displaced or decimated, often violently, as settlers invaded their territories. Environmental destruction from mining practices scarred the landscape. Racial tensions were also prevalent as non-white miners faced discrimination, violence, and exclusionary laws. Chinese immigrants, who played a vital role in the workforce, were often targets of hostility and legal barriers. These contradictions highlighted the uneven access to the American dream, even in a moment defined by possibility. Despite its harsh realities, the gold rush left a lasting legacy. It became a symbol of economic hope, a vivid chapter in the evolving story of a nation driven by aspiration. The vision of a better life, though elusive for many, was powerful enough to change lives, build cities, and redefine the boundaries of opportunity. It reinforced a core belief that still shapes the American identity, that with courage and effort, prosperity might be just within reach. Chapter 3: Struggles and Inequality. As the American dream continued to spread its influence across the growing nation, it became increasingly clear that its promises were not equally accessible to all. While expansion and economic growth brought opportunity to many, they also revealed deep divisions and injustices embedded in American society. The ideals of freedom, equality, and upward mobility often clashed with the realities of slavery, gender discrimination, and labor exploitation. For countless individuals and communities, the pursuit of the American dream was not a path paved with hope, but a struggle against exclusion and systemic barriers. Slavery stood as the most glaring contradiction to the nation's founding principles. While many Americans sought independence and prosperity, millions of enslaved Africans were denied even the most basic human rights. Their forced labor fueled the agricultural economies of the South, enriching white landowners and driving national growth at a terrible human cost. The institution of slavery was not only an economic system, but a deeply entrenched social order built on racial hierarchy and violence. As the country expanded westward, fierce debates erupted over whether slavery would be permitted in new territories. These conflicts exposed the moral fault lines in the American vision of liberty and set the stage for the Civil War. Women also found themselves largely excluded from the opportunities promised by the American dream. Legally and socially confined to the domestic sphere, women had little access to property rights, education, or political participation. Yet throughout the 19th century, women began to organize and advocate for greater equality. The Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 marked the beginning of the organized women's rights movement, where activists demanded suffrage and challenged the traditional roles assigned to them. Their efforts highlighted the limitations of a national identity that claimed equality while denying half its population the ability to shape public life. The rise of industrialization brought new economic possibilities, but also introduced a new class of exploited workers. As factories and railroads transformed the American landscape, laborers, many of them immigrants, endured long hours, low pay, and dangerous conditions. Child labor was widespread, and workers had few protections against abuse or poverty. In response, labor movements began to form, demanding fair wages, reasonable hours, and safer workplaces. Strikes and protests became more common as workers fought not just for better conditions, but for recognition and dignity. These struggles revealed a growing divide between the wealthy elite and the working poor, challenging the idea that hard work alone could ensure success. Despite the obstacles they faced, those who were marginalized did not accept exclusion quietly. Enslaved people resisted through rebellion, escape, and cultural survival. Women raised their voices in speeches, publications, and protests. Laborers built unions and risked everything to demand justice. These acts of defiance and resilience were not just responses to oppression. They were efforts to reshape the American dream into something more inclusive and just. The struggles of these groups pushed the nation to confront its contradictions and to begin the slow, painful work of living up to its own ideals. By the mid-19th century, it was clear that the American dream was not a fixed reality, but a contested idea. It was a vision that inspired millions, but one that also had to be constantly challenged and redefined by those it left behind. The dream persisted, not because it was fully realized, but because people continued to fight for their place within it. Slavery and the contradictions of freedom. At the very heart of the American identity lies a contradiction that shaped the nation's early history in profound and painful ways. The country was founded on ideals of liberty, equality, and the inherent rights of individuals. Yet it also upheld one of the most brutal and dehumanizing systems of forced labor the world has ever seen. Slavery was not a marginal aspect of American society. It was central to its economic development, social structure, and political conflicts. For generations, millions of African Americans were enslaved, denied basic human rights, and subjected to violence and exploitation, even as the rest of the nation celebrated freedom as its defining principle. From the colonial period through the Civil War, slavery was woven into the very fabric of American life, especially in the southern states. The wealth of Southern plantation owners was built on the backs of enslaved laborers who cultivated tobacco, cotton, and other cash crops. These commodities fueled national prosperity and global trade, tying the institution of slavery to the economic success of the entire country. Northern banks, insurers, and merchants also benefited from slavery, revealing that the system's reach extended far beyond the South. This interdependence made it harder to challenge slavery and help sustain it, even as it became increasingly controversial. The contradiction between slavery and American ideals was apparent from the nation's founding. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, but enslaved people were not considered part of this vision. The Constitution itself allowed slavery to continue, embedding it into law through compromises such as the Three-Fifths Clause and the Fugitive Slave Clause. These provisions gave slaveholding states political power while avoiding direct confrontation over the morality of the institution. Many leaders, including some who opposed slavery in principle, justified these contradictions as necessary compromises to maintain national unity. Yet enslaved people themselves never accepted the legitimacy of their bondage. Through acts of resistance, both subtle and overt, they challenged the system that denied their humanity. Some escaped to freedom via the Underground Railroad, others rebelled, and many more preserved their dignity through family, culture, and faith. Their resilience and courage undermined the narrative that slavery was a benevolent or necessary institution. Abolitionists, both black and white, began to speak out more forcefully in the early 19th century, calling attention to the hypocrisy of a nation that preached liberty while practicing bondage. Their activism slowly built momentum, forcing Americans to confront the moral and political consequences of slavery. As the country expanded westward, the question of whether new territories would permit slavery reignited tensions between North and South. These disputes fractured political parties, led to violent confrontations like those in Kansas, and eventually escalated into secession and civil war. The struggle over slavery was not just a fight over labor or property. It was a battle over the very meaning of freedom in the American context. Would liberty be a universal right or a selective privilege? Slavery represented the deepest challenge to the American dream, a glaring example of how ideals could be undermined by injustice. The system's eventual abolition did not erase its legacy, but it did mark a turning point in the nation's long journey toward living up to its founding promises. The contradiction between slavery and freedom continues to shape American history, serving as a powerful reminder that the pursuit of justice is ongoing and must be continually defended. The fight for women's rights. Throughout the 19th century, while the United States celebrated freedom and opportunity, women remained legally and socially excluded from many of the rights granted to men. They could not vote, own property after marriage in many states, attend most institutions of higher education, or participate fully in political life. Despite their central roles in family, community, and even reform movements, women were expected to remain in the domestic sphere, their contributions largely invisible to the broader public. Yet this imbalance did not go unchallenged. Over time, women began to organize, speak out, and demand change, initiating a long and determined struggle for equality that would challenge deep-rooted assumptions about gender and power. The early seeds of the women's rights movement were closely tied to other reform efforts, particularly abolitionism. Many women who advocated for the end of slavery also began to recognize the parallels between their own lack of rights and the oppression of enslaved people. In doing so, they found a new political voice. Leaders such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Sojourner Truth emerged from these activist circles, helping to shape the foundations of a movement focused on securing legal and social equality for women. These early efforts emphasized the need for access to education, control over property, the right to speak publicly, and eventually the right to vote. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 marked a defining moment in the campaign for women's rights. It was the first organized gathering dedicated to discussing the status of women in the United States, and it produced the Declaration of Sentiments, a bold document that echoed the language of the Declaration of Independence. It proclaimed that all men and women are created equal, and listed grievances against a society that denied women autonomy, citizenship, and justice. The convention sparked public debate and helped launch a national movement that would grow over the coming decades. Despite the courage and clarity of their arguments, early suffragists and women's rights advocates faced intense resistance. Many were ridiculed, threatened, or dismissed by politicians, religious leaders, and the press. The idea that women should participate in public life was seen as a challenge to traditional gender roles and family structure. Yet the movement persisted, fueled by growing networks of activists, publications, and organizations. Women began forming local societies, holding conventions, writing articles, and lobbying lawmakers, slowly building momentum in the face of widespread opposition. By the late 19th century, progress had been made in some areas. Women had greater access to education, could own property in more states, and were entering professions like teaching and journalism. Still, the right to vote remained elusive, and full political equality was far from achieved. The fight for suffrage would intensify in the decades to come, eventually culminating in the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. But the roots of that victory lay in the 19th century struggles, where women first declared their intention to be equal participants in the American democracy. The fight for women's rights exposed a fundamental flaw in the American dream, that equality was not yet universal. Women's activism forced the nation to confront its contradictions and expand its understanding of freedom. Their struggle was not only for their own liberation, but for a more inclusive and just society, one where the promises of the nation could truly belong to everyone. Labor movements and the working class. As the United States transformed into an industrial powerhouse during the 19th century, the nature of work changed dramatically. Massive factories, railroads, steel mills, and textile plants reshaped the economy and drew millions of workers into cities in search of employment. This rapid industrial growth created new opportunities, but it also introduced intense hardships for the working class. Long hours, low wages, unsafe conditions, and job insecurity were common. Many workers, including children, toiled in grueling environments with little protection or support. The promises of the American dream seemed distant for those whose daily reality was marked by exploitation. Out of this struggle, labor movements began to rise, giving workers a voice and demanding dignity, fairness, and reform. The early labor movement was fragmented and often met with fierce resistance from employers and the government. Workers who organized or went on strike risked being fired, blacklisted, or even attacked by private security forces or state militias. Nevertheless, workers pressed on, forming unions and staging strikes to demand better wages, shorter workdays, and safer conditions. One of the earliest and most famous examples was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which saw workers across several states walk off the job in protest of wage cuts. Though it was eventually crushed by force, the strike marked a turning point, signaling the growing power and unity of industrial workers. Unions like the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor gained prominence during the late 19th century, organizing workers across trades and advocating for labor rights on a national level. These organizations provided structure and support for workers, helping to negotiate contracts, organize boycotts, and press for legislation. While some focused on broad social reform, others concentrated on practical gains like an 8-hour workday and better pay. The labor movement gave the working class a sense of solidarity and a belief that collective action could lead to real change, even in the face of powerful corporate opposition. Despite some victories, labor activists often faced brutal repression. The Haymarket Affair in 1886, in which a bomb exploded during a labor rally in Chicago, led to widespread fear and a backlash against unions. Yet even this violence could not silence the call for justice. Immigrants, women, and children joined the fight, contributing to a diverse and determined movement. Over time, labor activism led to significant reforms, including the establishment of labor laws, child labor restrictions, and protections for union activity. These changes improved the lives of millions and reshaped the relationship between labor and capital in America. The struggle of the working class to secure fair treatment exposed a critical flaw in the prevailing narrative that success was simply a matter of hard work. Many Americans labored tirelessly yet remained trapped in poverty, unable to access the upward mobility they were promised. Labor movements challenged this myth and demanded recognition for the essential role that workers played in building the nation. By organizing and resisting, they pushed the country to reconsider what the American dream meant and who had the right to claim it. Their efforts not only improved material conditions, but also expanded the definition of democracy to include economic justice and workplace rights, laying a foundation that future generations would continue to build upon. Chapter 4: Reinvention in the Industrial Age. The Industrial Age in the United States marked a period of rapid change and transformation, both in the economy and in society. The shift from an agrarian to an industrial economy created new opportunities, but also introduced significant challenges. With the rise of factories, railroads, and large-scale manufacturing, the American landscape was redefined. Cities swelled with new immigrants and rural Americans, all seeking work in an economy that prized productivity and efficiency. In the midst of these changes, the concept of reinvention became central to the American dream. The promise that anyone could succeed through hard work and innovation was embodied in the booming industries, technological advancements, and cultural shifts that shaped the era. At the heart of this reinvention was the rise of the factory system. No longer confined to small-scale home-based production, industry flourished in urban centers where large factories could produce goods on an unprecedented scale. This new mode of production required a large workforce, often including immigrants who filled the ranks of laborers in harsh conditions. Although many workers toiled long hours for low wages, the industrial economy also produced a growing middle class. The new wealth generated by industrial magnates and entrepreneurs created an elite class that began to dominate politics and culture. These individuals, such as Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, became icons of the American dream, demonstrating how entrepreneurship and ambition could lead to vast success. Technological innovations also played a key role in the industrial transformation. Inventions such as the telegraph, the steam engine, and the sewing machine revolutionized industries and expanded the possibilities of what could be achieved. The construction of railroads connected distant regions, facilitating the movement of goods, people, and ideas across the nation. These innovations not only improved efficiency but also contributed to the creation of a national economy. They made new markets possible, allowed businesses to scale rapidly, and expanded access to resources. The country was no longer just a collection of isolated agricultural communities. It was an interconnected industrial powerhouse, brimming with potential. However, the rapid growth of industrialization also brought with it significant social upheaval. As factories flourished, so did the inequalities that came with them. While business owners and investors grew rich, workers were often subjected to poor working conditions, low wages, and little to no job security. The long hours and dangerous environments in which laborers worked highlighted the darker side of the American dream. Despite the promise of upward mobility, many found themselves trapped in cycles of poverty. For the wealthy, reinvention was synonymous with power and prestige. But for many workers, it meant little more than survival. At the same time, the industrial age also laid the groundwork for social and political movements that sought to address these inequities. Labor unions, women's rights groups, and civil rights activists all emerged as a response to the disparities created by industrialization. These movements sought to redefine the American dream, pushing for greater equality and access to the opportunities promised by the nation's ideals. The country was in the midst of a struggle to reconcile its ideals of freedom and opportunity with the reality of economic and social divisions. In many ways, the industrial age was a time of reinvention, but not just for the nation as a whole. It was a time when individuals, too, could redefine themselves through innovation, entrepreneurship, and hard work. Yet, the era also forced Americans to confront the contradictions inherent in the American dream. Was it truly available to all, or only to those with the means to access it? The answers to these questions would shape the next chapters of American history. Urban growth and the new middle class. The rapid industrialization of the United States in the late 19th century brought with it significant shifts in the country's economy and social structure. As factories and businesses expanded, they created a demand for labor, which in turn led to an explosion of urban growth. Cities grew rapidly, transforming the American landscape from a predominantly rural society into a largely urban one. This urbanization process reshaped the lives of millions, particularly as waves of immigrants from Europe and other parts of the world arrived in search of work and opportunity. With this growth came the rise of a new middle class, a group that played a central role in the cultural and economic development of the nation. For many Americans, urban centers like New York, Chicago, and Boston represented the promise of a better life. The economic boom brought by industrialization created jobs in factories, stores, transportation, and other sectors, drawing individuals and families from rural areas and foreign countries. These urban areas offered new opportunities for wealth and stability, and they became hubs for cultural exchange, innovation, and education. As the cities grew, so did the possibilities for advancement, especially for those who could carve out a niche in the expanding economy. This influx of people into the cities led to the creation of the new middle class. Members of this group typically worked in white-collar jobs such as clerks, managers, and professionals in fields like law, education, and medicine. They were the beneficiaries of the economic changes that were sweeping the country, and they were also the ones who helped shape the social and cultural values of the time. The middle class was characterized by a sense of stability and upward mobility, with many aspiring to a lifestyle that was distinctly different from the hardships faced by the working poor. They embraced values like education, home ownership, and a comfortable lifestyle, which they saw as the hallmarks of success in the new industrial economy. The rise of the middle class was also tied to changing social attitudes. As education became more accessible, particularly to women and children, a growing number of individuals began to aspire to professional careers and white-collar work. These jobs, though often still difficult and demanding, provided a sense of respectability and security. For many, the goal was to move up the social ladder, achieving not only financial success, but also recognition and respect. Middle-class families began to see homeownership as a key marker of success, and many worked toward securing property in rapidly growing suburban areas that were developing just outside urban centers. However, the growth of the middle class was not without its contradictions. While many in the middle class were able to achieve the stability and opportunity promised by the American dream, these benefits were not always available to everyone. The working poor, particularly in the rapidly expanding cities, continued to live in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions with little hope of improving their status. The urban poor faced harsh realities, such as low wages, long working hours, and a lack of access to basic services. Meanwhile, the wealthy elite grew more distant from the everyday struggles of the working class, reinforcing the divide between the affluent and the struggling. Despite these disparities, the rise of the middle class marked a pivotal moment in the history of the American dream. The middle class became the embodiment of the belief that hard work, education, and persistence could lead to upward mobility and a better life. In many ways, the new middle class reflected the enduring ideals of the nation: opportunity, individualism, and the possibility of reinvention. Yet, as urban growth continued, it also underscored the need for greater social and economic reform to ensure that the benefits of the American dream were not reserved for just a few, but accessible to all. Education and the rise of meritocracy. In the rapidly changing landscape of 19th century America, the idea of meritocracy, the belief that individuals could rise based on their abilities and achievements rather than their birth or social status, began to take hold. Central to this new vision was education, which came to be seen as the primary means by which individuals could improve their lives and attain success. As the nation expanded and industrialized, the demand for an educated workforce grew, and education became a powerful tool for social mobility. Schools, universities, and vocational institutions were built to provide the knowledge and skills necessary to thrive in an increasingly complex economy. Education, once reserved for the elite, was slowly becoming more accessible to a broader swath of the population, especially in urban areas. The rise of meritocracy was fueled by the belief that anyone, regardless of their background, could succeed through hard work, talent, and education. This idea was rooted in the nation's founding principles: freedom, equality, and opportunity, and became a central tenet of American identity. In many ways, the expansion of education was seen as a practical application of these ideals. Public schools began to proliferate in cities and towns, and institutions of higher learning, such as universities and technical schools, offered new avenues for upward mobility. The belief in meritocracy was embedded in the idea that through education, anyone could achieve success, regardless of their family's wealth or social standing. By the late 19th century, educational reform movements gained momentum, driven by the desire to make schooling available to all children, not just the privileged few. Public education became a key focus for reformers who saw it as essential for the nation's progress. Horace Mann, an early advocate for public education, argued that education was the great equalizer, enabling individuals to overcome poverty and discrimination. With the rise of public schools, children from working class and immigrant families gained access to a basic education, which provided a foundation for entering the workforce or continuing on to higher education. This expansion of education reflected a growing belief that success was a result of individual effort and ability, rather than family heritage or wealth. As the demand for education grew, so did the creation of specialized institutions aimed at meeting the needs of an industrial society. Vocational schools trained young people in skills necessary for factory work, while colleges and universities began to offer degrees in fields like engineering, business, and law, which were essential to the new economy. This proliferation of educational opportunities helped to create a system where individuals could gain the credentials and expertise needed to climb the social and economic ladder. However, access to higher education was still limited by factors like race, gender, and class, with African Americans, women, and poor immigrants often facing significant barriers to entry. Despite these challenges, the rise of meritocracy through education transformed the American dream. It reinforced the notion that anyone could rise to prominence based on their abilities and hard work, even if they started with nothing. It was no longer enough to rely solely on inherited wealth or connections. Success now depended on proving one's worth through education and achievement. This vision of a merit-based society helped to fuel the optimism and drive that characterized the United States during this period. Yet, even as the idea of meritocracy took root, the barriers faced by marginalized groups highlighted the limitations of this ideal. While education expanded, it was clear that true equality of opportunity had yet to be achieved. The belief in meritocracy would continue to inspire generations, but it also served as a reminder that structural inequalities had to be addressed for the American dream to be truly accessible to all. Consumerism and the modern lifestyle. As the United States entered the 20th century, it experienced a dramatic shift in both its economy and its cultural values. The rapid growth of industry, the rise of mass production, and the expansion of advertising created a new consumer culture that was fundamentally different from the previous agrarian society. With the proliferation of goods, services, and technology, Americans were encouraged to buy more than ever before. This shift towards consumerism became a defining feature of modern life, as the idea of success and happiness increasingly came to be associated with material wealth and the accumulation of goods. The modern lifestyle, characterized by a focus on consumption, leisure, and convenience, took hold of American society. The rise of consumerism was closely tied to the advancements in mass production and the expansion of industries that could produce goods on an unprecedented scale. Factories, powered by new technologies like the assembly line, made products cheaper and more widely available. This transformation of production helped fuel an economic boom and led to the development of a culture that prized consumption. Consumer goods like automobiles, household appliances, and clothing became more affordable, and new forms of entertainment, such as cinema and radio, made leisure a central part of American life. The idea of buying the American dream emerged, where material success was not only a personal achievement, but a reflection of one's participation in the growing economy. Advertising played a crucial role in shaping the consumer culture. With the expansion of print media, radio, and later television, advertisers were able to reach millions of people, promoting products as essential for happiness, success, and status. Companies began to focus on creating desires and needs in consumers that they had never thought about before. This cultural shift encouraged individuals to define themselves through the products they purchased and the lifestyle they could afford. The concept of keeping up with the Joneses became prevalent, where social status was increasingly determined by the goods one owned rather than personal achievements or virtues. As consumerism spread, it began to shape the American way of life. The notion of success shifted from self-sufficiency and hard work to the ability to afford the latest products and services. The suburbs, which expanded rapidly during the post-World War II era, became the physical manifestation of this new lifestyle. Houses, cars, and consumer goods became markers of achievement and success. People sought not just to survive, but to live comfortably and to display their success through material possessions. Consumerism brought convenience to everyday life, with innovations like washing machines, refrigerators, and cars transforming daily routines. However, this new lifestyle also brought with it certain challenges. The focus on materialism created a society increasingly defined by what people owned rather than who they were. The emphasis on consumption led to a growing divide between the wealthy and the poor, as not everyone could afford the luxuries promoted by advertising. Additionally, the rise of consumer culture had environmental consequences, as the demand for goods led to increased production, waste, and resource depletion. The pressure to consume also had psychological effects, contributing to feelings of inadequacy or anxiety among those who could not keep up with the expectations set by the consumer-driven society. Despite these challenges, consumerism became a central feature of the American dream. It embodied the idea that happiness could be achieved through the acquisition of goods, and it provided a tangible way for individuals to measure their success. The modern lifestyle that emerged was one defined by convenience, comfort, and the pursuit of material wealth. Yet, as the country moved further into the 20th century, questions about the sustainability of this consumer-driven ideal began to emerge, signaling that the pursuit of material success might not be the ultimate answer to the quest for happiness and fulfillment. Chapter 5: Crisis and Recovery. The early 20th century in the United States was a time of significant upheaval and transformation. While the country had been experiencing rapid industrial growth and rising consumerism, it also faced major economic crises that would challenge the very foundations of the American dream. The most significant of these crises was the Great Depression, which began with the stock market crash of 1929 and continued throughout much of the 1930s. The crash sent shockwaves through the economy, leading to widespread unemployment, poverty, and homelessness. For many, the belief that hard work and perseverance would lead to success seemed increasingly out of reach. The American dream, once a beacon of hope and opportunity, seemed to crumble as millions of Americans struggled to survive in an economy that seemed beyond their control. The Great Depression exposed the fragility of the nation's economic system. The stock market crash wiped out the savings of countless Americans, leading to bank failures and a collapse in consumer spending. As businesses closed and factories halted production, millions of people lost their jobs, and entire industries faltered. The widespread unemployment and the collapse of the agricultural sector, particularly in the Dust Bowl-ravaged Midwest, created an atmosphere of despair. For many, the dream of achieving a better life seemed impossible as they faced hardship and uncertainty. Families were displaced, lives were shattered, and the promise of upward mobility seemed far from attainable. In response to the crisis, President Franklin D. Roosevelt introduced the New Deal, a series of programs aimed at providing relief, recovery, and reform to the American people. The New Deal fundamentally reshaped the role of the federal government in American life. Roosevelt's policies included the creation of social safety nets, such as unemployment insurance, Social Security, and public works programs that provided jobs for millions. The government became more directly involved in regulating the economy, with reforms aimed at preventing another crash, including the establishment of the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, to protect savings and regulate financial markets. Roosevelt's vision of recovery was one that included the idea that the government had a responsibility to ensure that the American dream was still achievable, even in times of crisis. The New Deal was not without its critics, but it provided much-needed relief to those suffering during the Great Depression. It restored faith in the government's ability to act in the interest of the people and demonstrated that recovery was possible, even from the depths of a severe economic downturn. While it did not immediately restore the nation to full prosperity, the New Deal laid the groundwork for a more stable and equitable economy. It helped to create a social safety net that would endure for generations and gave Americans a renewed sense of hope that they could overcome adversity. The recovery process continued throughout the 1940s, accelerated by the onset of World War II. The war effort mobilized the American economy, creating millions of jobs and driving industrial production to new heights. The war also led to significant social changes as women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers and African Americans migrated to cities in search of employment. The war's economic impact helped to pull the country out of the Depression and set the stage for the post-war boom that would follow. While the Great Depression was a time of immense hardship and struggle, it also marked a turning point in the nation's understanding of the American dream. The crisis revealed the limitations of the previous economic system and highlighted the need for a more inclusive and supportive society. The recovery efforts that followed helped to redefine the dream itself, emphasizing that it was not solely an individual pursuit, but a collective effort that required the government, businesses, and individuals to work together to build a more stable and just society. The Great Depression and lost faith. The Great Depression, which began with the stock market crash of 1929, was the most severe economic downturn in American history, lasting well into the 1930s. It shattered the optimism and belief in the American dream that had been a defining feature of the nation's identity. As banks failed, businesses collapsed, and unemployment soared, millions of Americans found themselves in desperate circumstances. The economic security that many had once taken for granted seemed to evaporate overnight, leaving people disillusioned and uncertain about their futures. The promise that hard work would lead to success appeared false for countless families who struggled to survive. During this time, the nation's faith in its economic system began to unravel. The stock market crash, followed by widespread job losses, exposed the fragility of the capitalist system. Entire industries faltered, and the financial collapse left millions without savings or access to credit. For many, the American dream seemed out of reach. Small farmers faced foreclosure, and urban families faced eviction as their incomes dried up. The crisis left deep scars, with many people questioning whether the nation's ideals of prosperity and opportunity could truly be realized for everyone. As the Depression dragged on, social and economic inequality became more pronounced. The gap between the rich and the poor widened, and the struggling middle class found itself on the brink of collapse. The government's slow response only deepened the sense of despair. It seemed as though the promise of upward mobility, the very foundation of the American dream, was increasingly unattainable for those who had once believed in it. In the face of these dire circumstances, many Americans lost their faith in the traditional systems of government and business. The notion that individual effort could overcome adversity seemed increasingly unrealistic when so many people were doing everything they could and still falling short. This loss of faith was a catalyst for the political shifts that would come in the following years, particularly with the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt's New Deal, which aimed to provide relief, recovery, and reform, marked a shift in how Americans viewed the government's role in supporting its citizens. While the Great Depression did not immediately resolve, it led to a profound reevaluation of the American dream and the role of the state in ensuring that all citizens had the opportunity to achieve it. The New Deal and government intervention. The Great Depression exposed the vulnerabilities of the American economic system and led to widespread disillusionment. As millions of Americans faced unemployment, poverty, and insecurity, the traditional belief that the government should have minimal interference in the economy began to shift. The election of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932 marked a turning point as he introduced the New Deal, an ambitious series of programs and reforms aimed at providing relief, recovery, and reform. Roosevelt's approach fundamentally changed the relationship between the government and the people, emphasizing the responsibility of the state to ensure the welfare of its citizens. The New Deal was a direct response to the economic collapse, aiming to provide immediate relief to those suffering and to address the long-term structural issues that had caused the crisis. Programs such as the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, The Public Works Administration, PWA, and the Works Progress Administration, WPA, created millions of jobs for unemployed workers. These initiatives put people to work, building infrastructure, roads, schools, and public buildings, providing both relief and a sense of purpose to struggling families. The New Deal sought to alleviate the hardships faced by the poor while also stimulating economic recovery. In addition to relief programs, the New Deal focused on reforming the financial system to prevent future economic crises. The establishment of the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, aimed to regulate the stock market and protect savings, respectively. Roosevelt also pushed for labor rights, leading to the creation of the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, and the Social Security Act, which provided economic security for the elderly and unemployed. While the New Deal did not immediately end the Depression, it restored confidence in the government's ability to address economic challenges. Roosevelt's interventions demonstrated that the government could play a central role in supporting the nation's well-being. By expanding the scope of government programs and regulation, the New Deal reshaped the American welfare state and redefined the role of government in the lives of its citizens. Ultimately, the New Deal helped restore faith in the American system and reinvigorated the national economy. It did not completely eliminate poverty or unemployment, but it laid the groundwork for a more active interventionist government. The legacy of the New Deal was a lasting shift in American political and economic thinking, paving the way for future reforms and reshaping the American dream to include a more inclusive vision of prosperity. War mobilization and national unity. World War II marked a defining moment in American history as the nation transitioned from the depths of the Great Depression into a period of unparalleled economic growth and national unity. The war effort required the full mobilization of the American economy and society, leading to the involvement of millions of men and women in the military and workforce. The demands of war reshaped the American landscape, creating a sense of shared purpose and identity that united people from diverse backgrounds. The urgency of the war effort galvanized the nation, and the collective determination to win created a new sense of pride and patriotism that was instrumental in the nation's recovery from the economic collapse of the previous decade. With the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States was thrust into the war. Almost overnight, the country shifted from a peacetime economy to one focused on war production. Factories that had previously produced consumer goods were retooled to manufacture weapons, ammunition, and vehicles for the military. This rapid conversion helped put millions of Americans back to work, reducing the unemployment that had plagued the country during the Depression. Women, who had previously been excluded from many sectors of the workforce, stepped into roles in factories, shipyards, and offices. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter symbolized the critical role women played in supporting the war effort, and their contributions marked a significant step toward gender equality in the workplace. The war also brought about significant changes in the racial dynamics of the United States. While African Americans continued to face segregation and discrimination, the demand for labor during the war created new opportunities for Black workers in industries that had previously excluded them. This shift laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement that would gain momentum in the post-war years. Similarly, the war effort spurred a migration of Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and other immigrants to fill labor shortages, helping to shape the nation's multicultural identity. Despite the challenges, the unity forged during World War II was profound. The shared sacrifice, the collective effort on the home front, and the successful conclusion of the war helped to solidify a sense of national pride. The post-war economic boom, fueled by wartime production, set the stage for the rise of the American middle class and a renewed belief in the potential of the American dream. The war not only brought an end to the Depression, but also created a new era of prosperity, unity, and global influence for the United States. Chapter 6: Post-War Prosperity and Protest. Following the conclusion of World War II, the United States entered a period of remarkable economic growth and social change. The post-war years were marked by an unprecedented rise in prosperity, as the nation enjoyed a booming economy fueled by consumer demand, technological advancements, and a strong industrial base. This prosperity, often referred to as the post-war boom, brought greater wealth, opportunity, and comfort to millions of Americans, particularly in the suburbs. However, beneath the surface of this widespread prosperity, tensions and inequalities simmered. As the American dream flourished for many, a growing movement of protest began to challenge the social and political structures that had created disparities in wealth, opportunity, and civil rights. The prosperity of the post-war era was driven by several factors, including increased industrial production, a booming housing market, and a rising standard of living. With the GI Bill providing education and housing benefits for returning veterans, millions of families moved into newly built suburban homes, creating the iconic image of the American middle class. Cars, televisions, and household appliances became ubiquitous, and the promise of material success seemed more attainable than ever. For many, the post-war years represented the fulfillment of the American dream: economic security, home ownership, and upward mobility. However, as the economy grew, so too did the awareness of its limitations. Racial segregation remained entrenched in many parts of the country, particularly in the South, where African Americans were still subjected to systemic discrimination and inequality. Despite the progress of the war years, Black Americans continued to face barriers to voting, education, and employment. This led to the rise of the civil rights movement, which called for an end to segregation and equal rights for all citizens. Activists like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X became the faces of this struggle, demanding that the American dream be expanded to include African Americans. At the same time, the 1950s and 1960s saw a growing youth movement that began to question traditional social norms. The rise of rock and roll, the counterculture, and protests against the Vietnam War challenged the conformity and materialism that had defined post-war society. Young people, disillusioned with the government's actions and the social expectations placed on them, began to demand change. The protest movements of this era were not just about civil rights or anti-war sentiments. They were about redefining what it meant to be American in a rapidly changing world. The post-war period was a time of both prosperity and protest, with the American dream at the center of the debate. As the nation experienced economic growth, it also grappled with its deep-seated inequalities. The demands for civil rights, gender equality, and social change would redefine the nation's ideals and push America to live up to its promises in new ways. The combination of post-war prosperity and the voices of protest marked a pivotal moment in American history, challenging the nation to expand the American dream to include all its citizens. Suburbia and the ideal American life. In the years following World War II, the United States experienced a dramatic shift in its social and economic landscape. The post-war period ushered in an era of unprecedented prosperity and growth, and one of the most visible symbols of this new American ideal was the rise of suburban living. Suburbs, with their quiet streets, single-family homes, and neatly manicured lawns, became synonymous with the ideal American lifestyle. This image of suburban life was fueled by the economic boom of the 1950s, which created an expanding middle class that sought comfort, stability, and upward mobility. Suburban growth was largely driven by the availability of affordable housing, facilitated by programs like the GI Bill, which helped returning veterans purchase homes. The construction of new highways and the increasing availability of cars made it easier for families to live farther from urban centers while still maintaining access to jobs and services. These suburban developments promised a life of peace, privacy, and success, and they became the dream for many American families. The typical suburban family was portrayed as having a steady income, a house in a quiet neighborhood, and access to good schools and community resources. This vision of the ideal life resonated deeply with the American public, and the suburbs became the ultimate symbol of the American dream. For many, suburban life offered a sense of security and stability that had been lacking during the Great Depression and World War II. Families could build wealth through home ownership, and the suburban environment was seen as safer and more desirable than the crowded, often chaotic cities. The suburbs also provided the promise of upward mobility, with families believing that through hard work and dedication, they could achieve economic success and give their children a better future. The rise of consumer culture in the suburbs reinforced this ideal, with families purchasing the latest appliances, cars, and other goods to reflect their success and prosperity. However, the suburban dream was not accessible to all. Racial segregation was deeply entrenched in many suburban areas, and African Americans and other minorities often faced discrimination when attempting to move into predominantly white neighborhoods. The rise of suburbia also highlighted the gender roles of the time, where women were often expected to fulfill traditional roles as wives and mothers, focusing on homemaking rather than pursuing careers or personal ambitions. This limited view of the ideal life left many feeling excluded or dissatisfied. While suburbia represented the fulfillment of the American dream for many, it also exposed the limitations and inequalities within that dream. The image of the perfect suburban family, with its white picket fence and steady job, was not universally attainable. Yet it continued to shape the aspirations of Americans throughout the 1950s and beyond, reflecting the nation's enduring belief in the possibility of reinvention and success. Civil rights and demands for inclusion. The post-war period in the United States was a time of social upheaval and transformation, particularly in the realm of civil rights. Despite the nation's ideals of freedom and equality, African Americans and other minorities continued to face systemic discrimination and segregation, particularly in the southern states. The 1950s and 1960s witnessed a powerful movement for civil rights as African Americans and their allies demanded full inclusion in American society and an end to racial segregation. The civil rights movement sought to bring the promises of the American dream to all citizens, regardless of race, and to dismantle the legal and social barriers that had long excluded Black Americans from the full benefits of citizenship. The struggle for civil rights was marked by significant events, leaders, and actions that challenged the deeply entrenched racism of American society. One of the most pivotal moments came in 1954, when the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. This landmark decision was a major victory for the movement, but the fight for integration continued across the country, often met with fierce resistance. In response to the violent backlash in the South, activists organized peaceful protests, sit-ins, and marches to demand equal treatment. These nonviolent demonstrations, including the famous March on Washington in 1963, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech, garnered widespread attention and helped shift public opinion. Throughout the 1960s, key legislative changes were enacted to address racial discrimination. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were landmark achievements that sought to eliminate segregation in public places and ensure voting rights for African Americans. These laws marked significant progress, but they did not fully eradicate racial inequality, and the struggle for civil rights continued in the following decades. The movement also brought attention to the broader issue of inclusion, extending beyond race to encompass gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. Women, Native Americans, and other marginalized groups began to voice their demands for equality and justice. The Civil Rights Movement laid the foundation for subsequent social movements, including the Women's Liberation Movement, the Chicano Movement, and the LGBTQ+ rights movement, all of which fought for inclusion and recognition in American society. The demands for civil rights and inclusion fundamentally reshaped the American dream. The idea that all people, regardless of race or background, could achieve success and equality became a central focus of American politics and culture. Although challenges remain, the civil rights movement left an enduring legacy, making it clear that the dream of liberty and opportunity must be inclusive, offering freedom and justice for all. Vietnam, counterculture, and dream rejection. The 1960s were a time of great social and political upheaval in the United States, as the country faced deep divisions over the Vietnam War and the direction of its national identity. The war, which escalated throughout the decade, became a focal point for widespread protest, particularly among younger generations. The war was seen by many as an unjust conflict that led to the loss of American lives and the destruction of Vietnamese society. As the number of casualties mounted and the war dragged on, disillusionment grew, and the promise of the American dream, an ideal tied to justice, liberty, and opportunity, began to be questioned by an increasing number of Americans. For many, the war was a stark contradiction to the values that the nation claimed to uphold, leading to mass protests and the rejection of traditional American ideals. The counterculture movement of the 1960s, often symbolized by the hippie movement, represented a form of rebellion against the materialism, conformity, and violence that characterized mainstream society. Young people, particularly college students, began to reject the consumer-driven values of the post-war era and embraced alternative lifestyles that emphasized peace, love, and personal freedom. The counterculture movement was deeply intertwined with the anti-war movement, as many saw the United States' involvement in Vietnam as a manifestation of a broader societal failure to live up to its own principles. Music, art, and literature from this era reflected a growing sense of disillusionment with the American dream and a desire for a more authentic, compassionate way of life. The protests against the Vietnam War reached their peak in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Demonstrators filled the streets of major cities, marching and speaking out against the government's handling of the conflict. The most significant event was the Kent State shootings in 1970, when National Guardsmen opened fire on students protesting the war, killing 4 and injuring 9. This tragedy galvanized the anti-war movement and marked a turning point in the way the American public viewed both the war and the government. For many, the incident symbolized the government's disregard for the rights and lives of its citizens, further undermining faith in the American system. The rejection of the American dream during this period was not just about opposition to the Vietnam War. It was also a broader critique of a society that prioritized material success, consumerism, and war over peace, justice, and equality. The counterculture movement sought to redefine what it meant to be American, emphasizing personal fulfillment, social justice, and collective well-being rather than the pursuit of wealth and individual success. While the war ended in 1975, the cultural shifts of the 1960s left a lasting impact on American society, shaping future generations' understanding of the American dream and its limitations. The rejection of the traditional dream set the stage for new movements that continued to challenge the status quo and call for a more inclusive and just society. Chapter 7: The Dream in the 21st Century. Entering the 21st century, the American dream continued to evolve, reflecting the dynamic shifts in the nation's economy, culture, and global position. While the dream of prosperity, freedom, and opportunity remained a central part of the national identity, it was increasingly questioned and redefined. The rapid pace of technological advancement, the rise of global competition, and growing social inequalities all contributed to new perspectives on what it means to achieve success in America. The traditional vision of the American dream, based on home ownership, steady work, and upward mobility, was challenged by a changing landscape marked by economic volatility, increasing wealth gaps, and a shifting workforce. The dot-com boom at the turn of the century briefly reignited optimism about new opportunities, particularly in the tech sector. Many Americans saw the rise of Silicon Valley and the increasing importance of technology as a new path to success. Entrepreneurs and innovators like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates became symbols of the new American dream, demonstrating that anyone with the right idea and work ethic could build vast fortunes. However, this optimism was tempered by the reality of the 2008 financial crisis, which exposed the fragility of the economic system. Millions of people lost homes, jobs, and savings as banks failed and the housing market collapsed. The crisis highlighted the widening gap between the wealthy elite and the rest of the population, leading many to question whether the American dream was still attainable for all. In the aftermath of the Great Recession, the dream of upward mobility seemed increasingly out of reach for many. The rise of income inequality, combined with the stagnation of wages for much of the working and middle class, created a sense of frustration and disillusionment. For the first time in decades, many Americans found that their children were less likely to achieve a higher standard of living than they themselves had. This stark shift led to growing calls for economic reform and greater social safety nets, as the American dream was seen as slipping away for large segments of the population. Simultaneously, the 21st century brought a new wave of social movements that pushed for greater inclusivity in the definition of the American dream. The LGBTQ+ rights movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the fight for gender equality all emerged as critical forces challenging traditional notions of success and equality. These movements highlighted the importance of ensuring that the American dream was not just for a select few, but for everyone, regardless of race, gender, or sexual orientation. As the nation looks toward the future, the American dream in the 21st century is being redefined by a more diverse, more inclusive vision. While the traditional ideals of prosperity and opportunity continue to resonate, they are now being understood through the lens of equity, sustainability, and social justice. The dream is no longer just about individual success, but about creating a society in which everyone has the chance to thrive. As the country grapples with these challenges, the quest to achieve the American dream remains an ongoing pursuit, one that will require new solutions and a renewed commitment to the principles of equality and justice. Economic shifts and the new inequality. The 21st century has been defined by significant economic shifts that have reshaped the landscape of the American dream. While the United States continues to be a land of opportunity, the nature of that opportunity has changed dramatically. The transition from an industrial economy to a service and technology-driven one has created new avenues for wealth generation, but it has also intensified inequality. Economic growth in recent decades has largely benefited the wealthiest Americans, leaving the middle and lower classes behind. The gap between the rich and poor has expanded, fundamentally altering the way Americans think about success and opportunity. The rise of the tech sector has been a major driver of this economic shift. Silicon Valley, with its high-paying jobs and cutting-edge innovations, has become a symbol of the new economy. For a small group of entrepreneurs, engineers, and investors, the digital age has led to enormous fortunes. The wealth created by companies like Google, Apple, and Facebook has transformed individuals like Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos into some of the richest people in history. This concentration of wealth has sparked debates about fairness and the sustainability of an economy where a handful of individuals control a disproportionate share of the nation's resources. Meanwhile, many workers in traditional industries, such as manufacturing and retail, have seen their wages stagnate or decline. Automation, outsourcing, and globalization have eroded many of the jobs that once provided a stable middle-class life. Workers with skills suited to the old economy have found themselves displaced, and many are struggling to keep up with the rapid pace of technological change. The rise of the gig economy, where workers have less job security and fewer benefits, has also contributed to the growing sense of economic instability. This has created a divide between those who can adapt to the new economy and those who cannot. The widening gap between the rich and poor has sparked growing concerns about the future of the American dream. For many, the promise that anyone can rise to success through hard work and determination seems increasingly out of reach. The dream of homeownership, job security, and upward mobility has become more elusive for large portions of the population. As economic inequality continues to grow, questions about the fairness of the system have become more pressing. The challenge now is to create an economy that offers greater opportunities for all Americans, regardless of their background or economic status, and to ensure that the promise of the American dream is accessible to everyone, not just the privileged few. Immigration, diversity, and redefinition. As the United States entered the 21st century, immigration became an increasingly central issue in the national conversation about identity, opportunity, and the future of the American dream. For centuries, America has been a destination for people from all over the world seeking a better life, and this continued into the modern era. However, in the face of global political and economic changes, debates about immigration and diversity took on new urgency. The demographic landscape of the nation shifted, and the diversity that had always been part of the American fabric became a defining characteristic of the 21st century. Yet, as the country became more diverse, questions about who could truly claim the American dream and how it should be redefined arose. Immigration, particularly from Latin America, Asia, and Africa, reshaped the social and cultural landscape. Immigrants, often arriving with little more than the hope of a better life, sought opportunities in a nation that promised equality and the chance for upward mobility. For many, the American dream remained an attractive and motivating force, but the journey to achieving it was fraught with challenges. Immigrants faced systemic barriers, including limited access to education, healthcare, and employment opportunities. Many faced discrimination and prejudice based on their race, ethnicity, or immigration status, making it more difficult to fully participate in the promise of American society. At the same time, immigration brought new perspectives, talents, and innovations to the United States. Immigrants played key roles in various sectors of the economy, from technology to agriculture to healthcare, helping to drive economic growth and enrich the cultural fabric of the country. The nation's diversity also began to be seen as a source of strength, with multiculturalism being celebrated in some areas as an essential component of American identity. Immigrants contributed not only to the economy, but also to the social and cultural vibrancy of the nation, as new languages, foods, traditions, and ideas became woven into the national experience. Yet, the increasing diversity also prompted a backlash in some segments of society, as nativist sentiments and fears about the erosion of traditional American values gained traction. The debate over immigration policy became increasingly polarized, with some calling for stricter border controls and others advocating for greater inclusion and pathways to citizenship. These debates raised critical questions about what it means to be truly American and whether the American dream could be shared equally by all who called the nation home. As the country grapples with these questions, the definition of the American dream continues to evolve. The challenge is to ensure that the promise of opportunity, freedom, and prosperity is extended to all Americans, regardless of their background. Immigration and diversity have become central to the redefinition of the American dream, forcing the nation to confront its past, acknowledge its complexities, and work toward a future where everyone has the opportunity to achieve their version of the American dream. Technology, globalization, and the future ideal. As the 21st century progresses, technology and globalization are reshaping the American dream in profound ways, creating both new opportunities and complex challenges. The rapid pace of technological innovation, coupled with the interconnectedness brought on by globalization, has created a world where economic, social, and cultural boundaries are increasingly fluid. For some, these changes represent the dawn of a new era of prosperity, where new industries and digital economies offer unprecedented possibilities. For others, however, the effects of globalization and technological advancement have contributed to greater inequality and job displacement, questioning whether the American dream remains achievable for all. Technology has transformed nearly every aspect of daily life, from the way people communicate to how they work and shop. The rise of the internet, artificial intelligence, automation, and robotics has revolutionized industries and opened new markets, creating a digital economy that spans the globe. In many ways, this new economy mirrors the ideals of the American dream: innovation, entrepreneurship, and the ability to reinvent oneself. Silicon Valley, the epicenter of technological development, serves as a modern-day symbol of the American dream, where individuals like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk are seen as examples of what can be achieved through ingenuity and risk-taking. For many, the promise of success in this digital age has inspired a new generation of entrepreneurs and tech innovators who believe that with the right skills and vision, anyone can succeed. However, this rapid technological advancement has also introduced significant challenges. Automation and artificial intelligence have disrupted traditional industries, replacing many low and middle-income jobs and contributing to a widening wealth gap. Workers in sectors like manufacturing, retail, and agriculture have found their jobs increasingly replaced by machines or outsourced to countries with cheaper labor. While the tech sector continues to thrive, many Americans are left behind in an economy that demands more specialized skills and education. This shift has led to growing concerns about economic inequality and the sustainability of the American dream, as access to opportunities becomes more dependent on education and technology literacy. Globalization, the process by which businesses and economies become interconnected across borders, has further complicated the future of the American dream. While it has brought lower prices for consumers, it has also led to the offshoring of jobs and the decline of certain industries. This has created a global economy where the United States is no longer the dominant economic force it once was. The challenge for the American dream in this new era is to adapt to a world where success is no longer solely determined by national borders, but by global competition and interconnected markets. In this new world, the American dream must be redefined. It will no longer be solely about individual success through hard work and perseverance, but about the collective effort to build an economy and society that provides opportunities for all, even in the face of technological change and global competition. The future ideal of the American dream may lie in ensuring that the benefits of innovation and globalization are shared equitably, and that all individuals, regardless of their background or economic status, have the tools and opportunities to succeed in this rapidly changing world. You have been listening to The American Dream, A History of the Nation's Ideals, written by Harry Montgomery, narrated by Cedar Reyes.